quickly. Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to the IMA public lecture. My name is Fadil Santosa. I'm the director of the Institute for Mathematics and its Applications. The IMA is a National Science Foundation Institute located on the campus of the University of Minnesota. It is a research center where mathematicians work closely with scientists and engineers on problems arising in fields outside of mathematics, such as physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, and industry. The IMA just celebrated its 30th birthday this year. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight. We chose Andrew Hodges to give a public lecture on the British mathematician Alan Turing for two reasons. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Turing's birth, and Andrew wrote what is considered by many the most important biography of Turing in 1983. Tonight you'll hear more about Turing's amazing contribution to mathematics. Let me say a few words about our speaker. Dr. Andrew Hodges is Senior Research Fellow in the Math Institute at the University of Oxford. He's also a Tutorial Fellow in Wadham College. He's well known for his work in an area of mathematics called mathematical physics. This is a field where you try to understand the inner workings of nature and of the universe using the language of mathematics. For example, his mathematics can predict what happens when you smash particles together in a collider. But for tonight, Andrew will focus on his attention on Alan Turing. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Hodges.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the end of Alan Turing's centenary year, which makes him sound terribly old. He's 100 years old, but I want to talk about him as a young person, which is what he was when he was alive. He had a rather short life, and it was very distinctive for being a young contributor to the whole wonderful process of mathematics and science. So that's my picture of Alan Turing at a crucial moment, which I'm going to concentrate on to start with anyway. What did he do? Why do we care about Alan Turing? What's special about him? You may never have heard of him before and wonder why on earth we're making such a fuss. But essentially, he was the inventor of the computer. I mean, that's the crucial idea. I mean, we can modify that claim a bit, but that's his central claim to an intellectual place in the 20th century history and why we care about him. And computers might have seemed extremely remote to everyone in everyday life during his lifetime, but everyone now has one. I mean, everyone's got one sitting around. It's called a cell phone, and you all know the idea of it. He'll do countless different things for you, of which communicating telephone message is just one. And if you're familiar with this, all these applications come up that you can, at a press of a button, you can make it do all sorts of different things. That universality, the way it's taking over whole industries, whole fields of human activity relentlessly, is really due to his conception of a universal machine, which he formulated in 1936, well before anyone had even the word computer or digital computer to use. That was his great contribution. And that's a photograph of him in 1936. I think that's essentially the same photo as appears on the poster, but it hasn't got lots of zeros and ones all over it like the decoration on the poster. And that's actually a passport photograph of him taken in 1936 on the occasion of him leaving England, where he was born, the United States, where he took what was, in modern terms, a postdoc period. So that's a period of moments of great success for him. He'd just done something very important, and he was setting off for a new life. He went back to England, as I'll describe, but it's an important moment, and I'll concentrate on that a bit, because I want to talk about him not just as someone who had marvellous ideas and theories and dreams, but actually was a doer, actually has set to work to actually achieve things and make mathematics work and do things in the actual real world. And in many ways his problems as well as his achievements flowed from the fact that he was not just a thinker but a doer. And I'll try and explain why that's important to him and why it's part, really, of the whole process of mathematics and its applications, which is what we're all thinking about in this lecture series. So now here's a bit of textual history, just a bit of showing off what he did actually write and do in 1936, is this concept of the universal machine, and that is the text that he had published in that year, the universal computing machine, completely new concept, put out in this highly abstruse mathematical paper of that year. He was then a fellow of King's College in Cambridge, not at all in contact with the world of actual practical computing, but he had the idea of the universal machine, and you can see his words there: it is possible to invent a single machine which can be used to compute any computable sequence. Well, you may wonder what on earth that is about, but it's about, in modern terms, running any computer program, and it's just the idea that I described to you about what a cell phone does, of doing any application that you put on it. So that idea, a single machine for all purposes, a universal machine, that was the idea that's at the center of his life and what makes him so important to people now. And he did this when he was 24. He was a very young man indeed to come up with these really quite revolutionary ideas, and it's in many ways a mystery how he got them, where they came from. They didn't come from a great tradition of trying one thing and another thing and talking with lots of people and finally edging towards a solution of this idea. He seemed to come almost at once, in one go. He was a very special person like that. So I want to talk a little bit about where he came from as a boy and his whole background. Where did he get these ideas from? It's not to do with thinking about doing number crunching. He wasn't a nerdy number crunching person who was hunched over calculators and thought, how can I make a bigger and better calculator? He was thinking about mathematics, but also he had a very special thing which not all mathematicians have, but it's a way of putting the abstract things, abstract life of mathematics, the life of ideas and symbols and very abstruse ideas, into a very definite and concrete and practical form. That was a very special thing that he had, and that's the thing which saw him through many aspects of mathematical work, and in a very unusual way. So mathematical discovery and then application is at the heart of what he did. And in fact, there's a picture of him at school, about 16, and he wasn't very successful at school. I mean, he came bottom of the class in English and Latin and a lot of old-fashioned things. He came from a basically very old-fashioned English background and went through a very traditional kind of education, which he mostly ignored. I'm not trying to give advice to students here about how to behave. And in fact, I'm not going to propose Alan Turing as a role model for anyone at all. As you'll see, he came to a rather sticky end, and it's not necessarily a path that I advise people to follow. And he didn't start in the most improved manner, but what he did do, he latched on to the fact there was very exciting things going on in the world of physics rather than mathematics at first. Somehow he got hold of Einstein's exposition of the theory of relativity. This was in the mid-1920s when he was 16 or so. And he read Einstein's own account, and he made this comment that actually he thought it was a pity that Einstein didn't give all the exposition properly, and he would add a bit to what Einstein had said, and he actually perfectly correctly put in a bit which, rather surprisingly, Einstein had missed out of this account. It's what's called the law of geodesic motion, but I think it may give the flavour of his way of talking, and he was quite correct in doing this. There's a bit of a mystery how he was able to do this, but it was a wonderful picture of how a really rather isolated young man in a very old-fashioned place could be reached by the giants of scientific exposition in those days, of which Einstein was one. And I hope that the same thing can happen today, and that the wonderful plethora of popular science and scientific exposition is hopefully reaching people who are now young and exposed to all this material, and in the same way will actually touch people and get them going in a way that it did for him. More things he did in science at school, in chemistry and astronomy and other things he was interested in, and also particularly quantum mechanics, which was the newest of the new physics then in the 1920s. Very exciting moment. Again, he picked up somehow at school from a very famous book by an English scientist called Arthur Eddington, who was one of the first people to verify Einstein's predictions. A very famous book called The Nature of the Physical World. And he did this in conjunction with another young man whose picture is on the left, called Christopher Morcom. And that collaboration was the first thing that really brought him out of what would otherwise have been a very complete isolation. I mean, he wasn't a complete nerdy sort of character. He had many lively characteristics, but he was nevertheless not a very communicative young man. This made a big difference to him, and it played an important part in the next development in his life. Yes, I think I indicate that Alan Turing was not just a thinker and it's not just a beautiful mind. He wanted a life, and it's the developing life that he had which was most important to him. And also, as you may possibly guess from this picture, one was neither completely conventional, and it wasn't. And one thing about it that wasn't completely conventional, it was that during this period in his late teens, that he had become conscious of himself as a young game man whose feelings and emotions are always very strongly directed to other young men, and that sort of taken a long time for him to assimilate this identity, and it played a very important part in his life. Particularly because he was very taken with this other young man, Christopher Morcom, who I described. But Christopher Morcom suddenly died in 1930 when Alan was 18. And this meant that he had at that early age to deal with very sudden and deep emotional problems which mixed up his love life as it was developing in a very, very difficult way, but also he developed in a way which was actually intellectual as well. He developed it by thinking about what I call questions of life and death as they were posed in scientific terms, in terms that Eddington, who he was reading from, was thinking about the nature of the mind. What has the mind got to do with the body? Does the new physics make a difference to the description of the way we think about mind and matter? Could it be, Alan Turing asked at this stage, that mind was something independent of matter? Could he believe, as he would have liked to have believed, that the death of this friend was something that could be understood in terms of the mind leaving the body and yet surviving in some other way? These are very strange and very personal questions. We only know about them because he wrote an essay, which I've just shown some handwriting for on the screen, which is headed Nature of Spirit, and actually gives an exposition of this question to the parents of the boy who died, explaining his feelings and his wondering about the natural world and the nature of matter and nature of mind in very striking terms. So there was a very odd conjunction of highly emotional things with something that was actually a cutting edge of new physics, but also propelled him in a strange quest to understand the nature of mind and how it's embodied in the brain and in the world. That's the text that he actually wrote, and it begins with a description of the picture of science, which was the classical picture that is deterministic, that if you know what's happening at one time, you can predict what's going to happen in the future. And in this essay, he explained that quantum mechanics was thought to change this. So there's an element of probability comes in, that you can't predict, as many people then did and have done since. He linked this new development in physics with the possibility that mind and matter should be given a new interpretation. And just edging in this essay towards a theory of how one could make the idea of mental action into something that's scientific. Now, that's something he himself took forward in a quite different way later in his life, which shows that at the beginning of his scientific quest, there was this very strong emotional development in his life. It wasn't just a question of learning from the books about how to do maths very cleverly. He wanted to explore the mathematical foundations of the physical world so as to have some grip on these questions which deeply concerned him. So that's really what characterizes him in this very early stage. Although he was very clever at mathematics and then won a scholarship to Cambridge University, where he started learning mathematics in the adult world in 1931, it's also this very strong fundamental emotional grip on important questions. Now, so from a professional point of view, what did he do? Well, a lot of books which are out and papers which are at the advanced, cutting edge of what was going on in mathematical sciences at that point. But and some people will know some of these things. That one's very important name, and the first thing he was reading after school was that of the Hungarian mathematician John von Neumann, who had actually formulated the theory of quantum mechanics in a logical manner, which was then new. Von Neumann's most important person in the whole development of Turing's life, and we'll come to him later. But also reading Bertrand Russell on the foundations of logic. He would have done probably work in the foundations of probability theory, but then something else came along in 1935 which turned he had this aspiration to get at the fundamentals, to get at axioms, the basic facts about different branches of science. But something in 1935 turned this quest in a quite unexpected direction. Well, it went in the direction of logic, which he'd learned a bit about from Russell, but into something quite new. And that was because there was an older mathematician at Cambridge called Max Newman who gave lectures, very offbeat lectures. This was not at all the standard part of the course. This was something quite unusual, but it gave lectures on the world of mathematical logic in 1935. Turing went to these and found there was a problem here, which Newman explained to him, which he could tackle and which would change everything, and which indeed gave birth to the idea of the computer. So I should emphasize that this has nothing to do with building a better machine at that point. This is most abstruse stuff. He was motivated by these very pure questions. What is mind? What is matter? What is the logic? What is the underlying principles of science combined with the technical mathematics which he was learning? And he was grabbed by these very questions of principle, not by the questions of how to do it, but he wanted to combine these in his own very special way with something that was very concrete and very definite in how it would work. And that's what he latched onto, was this. And the developments of mathematical logic that had occurred in the beginning of the 1930s had left one question that was unanswered and needed an answer. And that question can be expressed in ordinary words. It is, what do you mean by saying you've got a method for doing something? A method or a rule or an algorithm, it's often called now, or just a procedure, or just some definite way of doing something. How can you systematize what is and what isn't a definite way of doing something? It seems such a vague question. How could it possibly have any kind of answer? How could you get anywhere with a question like that? Well, he did have an answer to that, but it's a very peculiar answer. And his answer was essentially, it's something that a computer program can do. And that's a crazy answer for me to say he gave, because of course computers didn't exist. But that actually expresses the strangeness of what he achieved at this point. Although that's not, in a sense, true. I mean, you couldn't say he gave that answer. That expresses very well the bizarre nature of what he actually did at this time. He gave an answer which was in terms of the future, really. It was to do with the way there had been a revolution in logic, and he turned that into a revolution in the idea of what computing was. He did something which went outside mathematical formalism and brought in the idea of actually doing something, actually a physical thing that would be actually doing a computation. It's the concept of a machine, which is always now called a Turing machine. And the Turing machine, by formalizing the idea of doing a calculation, gave this physical content and an engineering image to what he now defined as the computable. Now, it's very abstruse, and yet it's also very down-to-earth, with a very specific picture of what now would be called computer programs, but in that world didn't exist because there weren't any computers. But that's where he brought in the concept of the universal machine with which I started, because that supplied the idea of the computer on which you can run any program. So having got the idea that a program for a computer expresses the idea of what you mean by a rule or a method, he invented the computer as a way of explaining how you could put all these different methods on a single machine, a completely new idea. So in 1936 he came up with this paper which was on reformulated what you'd ever mean by computing. You had the idea of the universal machine, which is the computer of the future, a concrete picture of a machine reading and writing and doing stuff in just the way that computers do now, all the time, people are very familiar with. But also, it had this connection between the idea of the human mind and the machine. And that was very strongly, and that clearly dates from is based on his fascination with what mental states are, what it is that the mind's doing, and that goes forward into what became later on a very famous picture of the idea of artificial intelligence getting machines to do what human minds do, and seeing where the boundaries are. Are there things that minds can do that machines cannot do, or not? Where are the boundaries? That's the things which he addressed later on. Off he went to Princeton, as I've described. That photograph at the beginning was his passport to the United States. And at Princeton, there's a nice snapshot of him which has come to light comparatively recently. That's Alan Turing on the right-hand side, almost out of the picture, with a sideways look, a funny look to the side, not completely concentrating on what's going on, his own thoughts, if you like. That's a very telling photograph, just a chance thing, just a little snapshot that someone took. But that's rather typical of him, just almost out of the picture, on the edge of things, not really centred in the social centre, but in the edge with the ideas of his own. That's a nice image. But being in the United States in the late 1930s, everyone should be conscious, and the people were very conscious at Princeton in the late 1930s, of the European crisis and the possibility of another world war. And Turing was certainly aware of this. This was the background to his upcoming decision what to do with the rest of his life. It's not an easy thing to follow, actually, having an idea of that nature when you're 24. What do you do next with it? And he was someone who didn't just want to be a thinker, a theorist. He was actually drawn to the question of what to do with it. So while he was doing his PhD work, oddly enough, he did PhD well after having done this absolutely world, this completely groundbreaking work. On the side, quite on top of his official work in mathematics, he was doing something on the side which was it was work for the future. It was an application of his ideas in logic to codes and ciphers, which he saw had a whole mathematical basis, and where he discovered a new type of cipher system with particular and interesting codes which he saw could be of actual practical value. And he built electrical machinery which would implement these codes in the workshops at Princeton in 1937-38. So he had a choice at this point. Was he going to be a pure mathematician? We had a career structure which was opening up within that world. Or was he going to do unexpected things, which not at all what mathematicians were supposed to be doing, but something which had this character of actual application of his really unusual ideas? Well, the one answer is that he made a very definite decision in 1938. The great mathematician John von Neumann, whom I referred to earlier, did actually offer him a job at Princeton. He could have stayed there. He could have made a great career in pure mathematics. But he turned that down, and he returned to England. This was at a point where many people were doing the opposite thing and leaving the dangers of Europe and going to the comparative safety of the United States. but he definitely decided to go back to England, and he took with him his cipher machine, and the next stage was that essentially he volunteered for applying these ideas in the service of the British government at the point where it faced a major war with Nazi Germany. And I'm sure that Turing was quite aware of that, what he was walking into. He was quite aware of world events. But on the other hand, he was also very fascinated by the technical business of codes and ciphers, and it was a marvelous technical challenge as what to do next. Well, he didn't go immediately into war, and there's a nice parallel with something else that he did inside mathematics, but where he still used in a very unconventional way some machinery that he built for himself. Again, very unusual for a mathematician. He applied his ideas in the theory of numbers. Some people may well have heard of the problems of the theory of prime numbers, which is one of the things that Turing addressed at this time. And this is a rather curious application letter for funding to build a machine. And perhaps the most notable feature of that is the £40, which this research proposal, £40, so actually in those days that was it was $4 to the pound in those days, so it was $160 was the research proposal, and he actually got this funding. But in parallel with that, something else which also required the building of machinery to embody his strange ideas, and that was, that's the blueprint of the machine. That the machine wasn't completely built, but the blueprint survives, and people study it. But they needed something else from the summer 1938 onwards, and that was to become, in effect, the first and the chief mathematical and scientific figure in the communications war, the war of codes and ciphers between Great Britain and Nazi Germany at the outbreak of war in 1939. That was a department which was based on the kind of linguistic and textual analysis that had been used in the First World War, but during the 1930s it had to adapt. At the end of the 1930s became adapted to scientific methods, and Turing was the embodiment of new scientific methods brought into the communications war for the first time. So this is now famous, and Bletchley Park, which is pictured in there, and that's the actual building where Turing worked at the outbreak of war in 1939, is now a great museum, very popular museum, where all sorts of things are on display. But in that period, and indeed for decades afterwards, it was one of the most secret and closely guarded locations in the world, and hardly anyone knew about it. Insiders never spoke of it. So Turing at this point disappeared within a very secret world, quite the opposite of the open communicative world of mathematics. But that was his decision, a personal decision, to take on something of this immense responsibility. Immense because it turned out that the British knew very well, German military communications were enciphered on the now famous Enigma cipher machine, which had resisted systematic attack. It was a really complex logical device, and it essentially needed extremely sophisticated both logical ideas and mechanical equipment to make any impression or make any breaking of it in a systematic way. And this is what Turing achieved as, again, still a very young person. I mean, he was very much a civilian, nothing like a military-type person. I mean, it was like, actually, the situation not so dissimilar from what faced many young people of that period in coming into the Second World War. Famously, the people who came into the atomic bomb projects were also people who had nothing to do with the whole military world at all, often a completely different background from that. And so you had this really surprising thing that major things in the world events in the Second World War period were done by people who were complete outsiders in many ways to the social and political structure. And Turing was one of those, but he made a great impact with a machine which, for historical, rather strange reasons, was called a bomb. It was called that because that was the name given to a prototype devised by Polish mathematicians before the war, from whom Turing took many ideas, but greatly expanded into his own device. And this picture, I think, if the German cryptographers had seen these pictures in 1940, the world would have changed. These were the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War. At that stage, far more important than the atomic bomb, which was just it was just a dream at that point. These things in 1939, 1940, this logic diagram drawn by Turing on the right, which shows the logic of his code-breaking principle, which I won't try and explain, but is based on a fairly simple idea about chasing around logical implications in a mathematical way. The application of those logical ideas into the engineering of the machine, shown on the left, which managed to do something like a search engine kind of work, very sophisticated kind, through all sorts of logical possibilities to work out how the Enigma machine was set for the messages. That was, it's hard to believe it was possible at all. It's only just possible. It needed the most advanced engineering of the time to make it possible. It only just worked, but it did work to produce code breaking within hours rather than days or weeks, and actually very much changed the whole structure of the Second World War from the middle of 1940 onwards. So that was an extraordinary way in which someone who'd done this very pure kind of thinking, philosophical, abstruse, unapplied to practical problems, suddenly found that this same characteristic mode of thought was solving the most pressing problems of the world's contacts and events at that time, at a very critical moment of world history. So he was in a very odd position, not of course alone. He had a small group of other people of very high caliber, mostly mathematicians, working with him, who developed a lot of what would now be called communication theory. This piece of text here, it's a part of a paper he wrote called The Applications of Probability to Cryptography. This document was only released from secrecy this year, in April this year, and that's a measure of the fact that he actually just sketched out a whole theory of how to do code breaking in a systematic, modern, scientific way of really great significance, just that hardly anyone knew about it because it was all kept completely secret. For 1940, in fact, he introduced a concept of measuring the amount of information, which was essentially the same sort of measure as much more famously and openly was devised by Claude Shannon, the American originator of communication theory in the same period. So this is just leading work. Wrong one. But not only theory. There's always this connection between the groundbreaking theory and the actual application in a concrete manner. So, in fact, Alan Turing headed a small section at this establishment, Bletchley Park, at the centre of the British operations, which handled the communications of the German Navy, and in particular of the German submarines, which at that stage were dominating the Atlantic and the naval war between Germany and Great Britain. So that was Turing's own personal responsibility. That was the most critical aspects of the enciphered communications, but it was also the most difficult because it was the most, in modern terms, it was the most securely enciphered. In 1941, of course, the United States came into the war, and Alan Turing had the job of doing liaison with the United States Navy over this question. I've included this section of text here to give the flavour of his speech, which, as you can see, was not of a uniformly congratulatory nature on the collaboration that he found. He said this was a very tricky job, actually, being the personal representative of the British effort at the very difficult moments of liaison with the completely different United States Navy structure. As you can say, he didn't very well trust. He couldn't very well trust these people where a matter of judgment in cryptography is concerned. They certainly felt they were doing everything much better. That's probably slightly unfair to pick. I mean, that's a genuine paragraph, but I wouldn't say that characterized everything he did. I mean, he found obviously very, very high-level people in the American secret operations that he had to deal with as well, and which he fully appreciated. But a little bit of gives a little bit of an impression of what he was like to deal with, which was not always totally patient with other people. In the course of this, in fact, one of the very high-level people he met was Claude Shannon, and the context of that is the very important and new work on speech encipherment that was being done in the United States in the turn of 1942, 1943. That was an enormous problem in communications, that telephone communication is very much more difficult to encipher. It's just the same problem, I mean, nowadays on a cell phone, it's done, but that's because you have very reliable electronic chips which can do this at a very high speed. That sort of technology was not available at that time. It was a very difficult problem to encipher sound messages in an effective way. There was an American system which achieved this, which it was Alan Turing's job to vet on behalf of the British government, and then was used for communications at the highest level across the Atlantic. That's when he returned to England, he set out to build a better system, a more elegant system of his own. And that machine on the left is the machine which he built, an electronic enciphering machine which he built with his own hands, and with one electronic engineer assistant in 1944-45. And again, if that's I put on the right-hand side, the most significant number of symbols on there is the date. This was first published in October 2012. It's only recently been declassified. So this was again very cutting-edge work, well ahead of its time, many probably decades ahead of its time. The theory which went into this system, and this system's of importance not only because it was very advanced, but also because it gave him actual hands-on experience in electronics. And there's a big mathematical theory which went into the encryption system here, applied with the electronic components in a very ingenious way. And that was for him not only this work in cryptography, but it gave him like a test bed for what he really wanted to do next, which was to embody this concept of the universal machine in what we'd now call electronic digital computer. That was the next thing. That what happened in 1945. He emerged from the war as it ended in May 1945 with three very special things which all speak to us in the here and now. And the world of computers now began. Because Alan Turing had three things which only, I think, probably only three people in the world had, which was a theory of computation with a universal machine, a machine that could handle any task that you programmed, that you could write for it as a program. He had all the motivation and experience in the needs for such a machine, because in the code-breaking work they'd had countless operations they had to mechanize, but they'd all needed the engineering of special machines, which has taken a very long time. It'd be far better if you could write, in modern terms, just software for them, as people would now. Turing also had the experience of electronic technology, both indirectly in other branches of the war work, but also with his own hands in building this speech encipherment thing, something that very few mathematicians had any expertise in at all, but which he had gained for himself. And he had his very clear conception that you would apply mathematical principles to the devising of good systems. And, well, I put a rather cheeky quote of his about using American. This is a very unfair comment on his part. I don't know why I put that up. But because I'm sure, yeah, well, anyway. He would give as good as he got. He would take it in reverse. But anyway, the result was in March 1946 he did actually compose a detailed plan for an electronic computer, and it was accepted by the principal scientific laboratory of the British government, which was National Physical Laboratory in southwest London. But it's very important. I mean, Turing would have recognised that although he's slightly disparaging of what he called these American tradition, that really was a bit unfair. I mean, the thing was that it was the work of von Neumann and his group with the electronic machinery in mid-1945 which put the whole prospects of practical electronic computation in the centre of the map of what was going to be done in the world of the future. Without that background of push and prospects for enormous advance coming from the United States, Turing's plan wouldn't have had much of a chance. So I'm sure he'd have recognised that. But nevertheless, his own ideas didn't owe anything to the more famous. I mean, in later years, people tend to say that von Neumann's group were responsible for everything in the world of computation, electronic computation as it developed. But Turing didn't need those ideas. He had his own ideas. He had his own idea of the universal machine. That's what counted. And he wanted to implement those ideas in his own way, with his own mathematics of how electronics would work, and his own ideas about programming. Here is a curious photograph and a bit of text here which sums up what he was like, I think. First of all, he was very keen on running. He was a great runner. He liked quite a number of sporty things anyway. He was very keen on sailing as well. But he really went in for long-distance running after the war. And that's him running. And it was after one of the athletic matches that's on Boxing Day 1946 that I think he gave as far as I know, is the only clear statement about the authorship of the computer. I mean, who invented the computer? Because the sports reporter of one of the London newspapers asked him, I mean, Dr. Turing, you invented this wonderful new machine we've read about in the newspapers, didn't you? I mean, by that time, in 1946, there was quite a lot of publicity for what were being called electronic brains. And the reporter obviously asked him about this. And this, you can see from his reply that he didn't just say, yes, I am. But on the other hand, he didn't say, no, I'm not. And he said he was diffident. He was diffident about what he'd done, which is the self-deprecating, slightly pushing himself out of the picture thing, which I've illustrated before. But then there's a slightly snide comment that he gave credit for the donkey work being done in the United States, which is a slightly unfair way of so not the way that one should carry on really in scientific life, as a way of describing one's rival or colleagues in other research groups. But Turing didn't speak much about this question. I mean, he got on with his own thing. He wasn't full of comment about what other people were doing. The machine that he devised, I mean, it did come off, and I mean, in modified form, his design was built. It was running in 1950, 5 years later, and it's been in the Science Museum in London ever since 1958, and it's now the centre of a new exhibition around Turing's work. So it's never, for some reason, been as famous as other early computers of that period, but it was an absolutely going thing. There wasn't anything that was impractical or silly about it at all. It was just, it tended to be eclipsed by other developments, both in England and in the United States. But this was a tremendous technological leap, and his design was at the centre of it. But I think more important, I'll just bring out how Turing saw the future of computing, because it's really the software side, the question of what you can do with a computer, where he was really ahead. I mean, actually building a computer out of the rather primitive electronic components of those days is something which he knew was going to be rapidly superseded. But his ideas about what a universal machine was going to be for and why it was so important were much more far-reaching. So the first bits of text is just explaining, which is something that would have been very strange in 1945-46, the idea that you didn't need a new machine for a new task. You'd use the same machine but give it new paperwork. That was an extraordinary idea for the kind of people who were around at that time, who spent their lives building special machines for special purposes. And that needed a lot of explanation. That it wasn't even to do with numbers, that it would do things to do with, well, codes and ciphers, but also chess playing and things we now call artificial intelligence questions. That they would all be done, and all sorts of data processing, they could all be done by one machine. As he says, that would be puzzling that this could be done, but he did explain it. But the more deeper thing is the future of software. As he said, there's this visionary picture. All processes have to be translated into what we now call software. And that's something probably only about now really can appreciate how it is that one industry after another has been wiped out by being turned into computer applications. But also that this work would itself be something which could be, where writing of programs would be done by computers themselves, which indeed, I mean, that's what you do through the creation of computer languages, compilers, interpreters, all the things that are now done in the world of computer science. These are things which come about through the nature of the universal machine, that any operation that can be done by that machine, including all the routine work with computer programs themselves. And that's a very far-reaching idea in 1946. So Turing's design, the detailed electronic design, but really much more important were his ideas, what it was for. Well, that design, as I said, it was overshadowed a bit by other successes. A quite different approach to computers was taken at Manchester, where a very, very tiny machine, hardly any store at all, nevertheless did illustrate and show that the principle of the universal machine actually did work, and that got huge funding. And it's interesting that at this moment in June 1948, when this first working computer came into being, all the questions about the uses of computers were right there on the table straight away. Newman, who'd been introduced Turing to logic before the war, in the way I described, had taken over the development at Manchester. And the development at Manchester was specifically there for pure scientific research, pure research in mathematics and science. And Newman very cleverly devised a little problem in mathematics that could actually be investigated by the new tiny computer. But then Turing was interviewed by the Times, the press got onto this very quickly, and he sounded off it was really off-message way, that it was about the prospects for machine intelligence that were really interesting. This wasn't on the university agenda at all. This was thought highly. There was this, of course, the great controversy and upset that he said the interest in the building the computer was to see to what extent the machine could think for itself, which actually was his developing concern in this point. It was to see, he'd really got past seeing all the things that computers could do in the applications which were obvious in the world of that time. He really wanted to look to the future and see what were the boundaries of what a machine could do. Could it simulate the action of the human brain? Really going back to the questions which had engaged him right at the beginning of his research about the very nature of mind and matter. Of course, in the real world, as I've pointed out, the actual decision about the machine building was neither of these things. It wasn't pure science, and it wasn't Turing's idea either. It was actually getting a machine that could do the calculations for the British atomic bomb. But Turing was not concerned with that. He pursued his ideas, having moved to Manchester, and he's produced what actually is probably his most famous publication in 1950, which was this paper entitled Computing, Machinery and Intelligence, which is particularly famous for introducing a very witty kind of what's called the Turing test. It's a way of trying to give an objective picture of what one would mean by a machine rivaling or outdoing or failing to simulate what an intelligent person can do. But one interesting thing about this writing, which is very much studied by people of all kinds, because it's very accessible, it's full of illustration, it's full of jokes, and in particular it's full of stuff about Turing himself. It's a funny thing that although writing about the capacity of a machine to do things, it's actually full of substance about what it's like to be a human being, what it's like for him to be a human being, things about his own life and his own perceptions of mind, and as it were, saying, I'm human. It's a very curious piece of writing and shows a whole sort of new development of his life at this point. So here he was at Manchester in the north of England. The computer industry is really roaring ahead in an engineering direction which leaves him behind. He can't really contribute very much to that. One has to say there are things he didn't do. I mean, it would be a very good idea if he'd actually written a definitive book on text and explaining what it was about computers that had come into being, why they'd flowed out of his ideas, where they were going to go, what programming was all about, what hardware and software were all about. He didn't do that. There are bits and pieces, but he didn't do this in a definitive way that really would have made his name. He didn't follow up the ideas about languages, computer languages, that he clearly could have done, and he did something else. That's a little photograph of him. You can almost see him being edged out of the hardware of the computer and into a different world of his own. And it's a very surprising world, something you wouldn't have predicted. His actual work went into the field of mathematical biology. He used the Manchester computer as like his own personal computer, because it's one of the few computers in the world, and he had personal access to it. And he used it for really what was one of the first pure scientific research projects to use a computer in the modern way on the theory of biological growth. And something that always fascinated him about how it is that plants and animals take their shape. So that was, again, highly mathematical work in the theory of differential equations. Had this very hands-on flavour and actually seeing in computer graphic ways the actual growing processes, testing and trying out many forms of equations. That's where another part of his life came into the story. It was just in 1951, as he submitted this first groundbreaking paper in this area, that his life as a gay man, which I haven't said anything about, the various relationships and difficulties that he had in the mid part of his life, but it became clear that at this turn he really wanted to have more life. I mean, all the time. Life life and freedom was very much what he wanted, free thought and free action. But life, which he was investigating on the computer, real life was not so easy or so unproblematic to live. And there's a very curious expression that where he described his own situation in the third person. He's writing as if he's a character in a story, that it was as like a reward for doing this work in new mathematical biology. He was going to have a little fling with the it was very underground gay scene of Manchester as a big northern city in 1951. And it's a curious location. Christmas 1951, fairly grim setting in industrial city in northern England. There's the Manchester computer. It was being programmed to play music for the first time, and that was played on the BBC radio as a little harbinger of the whole world of the coming world of media technology. I mean, now it's a huge industry. A little picture of everything that computers might be doing. And that's where Alan Turing was buzzing around and actually met, he described the question of meeting someone suitable, but he met someone who was actually rather unsuitable, and it led to a great deal of trouble. At that time, any sex between men was completely illegal in England, as indeed in most countries. And he was arrested. It all came to light. He was arrested in February the 7th, 1952. He knew there was a risk of this. Everyone knew there was a risk of this. He referred to it. but he wouldn't probably have guessed exactly what it would lead to. It led to the punishment was not prison, which it could have been. He escaped prison, but only by accepting chemical castration, in effect. It was what called organotherapy, this injection of estrogen. It was just meant to neutralize his sexual life. It didn't succeed in that, but that was obviously extremely shocking and humiliating turn of events. That's the few lines at the bottom illustrate the kind of stoic humour which he tried to apply to his situation. It's full of play and irony and wordplay, reflections on culture. It's a reflection on his own theory of machine intelligence, and it's a reference to the fundamentals of logic and the idea of the syllogism. And this is a little taste of his thought world, but he was in a very, very difficult situation, because although this events had transpired as a very classic story of how the world of homosexual men was so dangerous and difficult in civil life, he wasn't just an ordinary person. He was a very special person, because he'd been the most important person in this most secret aspect of the Second World War, and indeed had continued secret work after 1948 in ways that we can't know exactly what they were, but they would have been extremely sensitive matters, probably involving a relationship with the United States as well as his own country, the United Kingdom. So he was in a very, very difficult position. You can see from these expressions what his attitude might have been to the formal nature of vetting and security and so forth. I mean, he was banned from doing secret work henceforth. You can see his classified an idiot. Oh, well, I can't think why he said that. But his reaction was essentially a positive one. His reaction was not one of just giving up or the submission to events. His reaction was of going abroad, beyond the reach of the English law, and in fact he was aware, it seems that he was aware of just the beginnings of the gay rights movement in Scandinavia, which in that very early period, and that's why he went to Norway in 1952. That had a consequence, because in 1953 a young man whom he'd met in Norway tried to visit him where he lived near Manchester, and he was stopped by the police, and Turing certainly found himself under considerable surveillance as a result, and that must, of course, be because of his special status. He wasn't just any gay man in that situation. He was someone who was privy to these enormous amount of secret information at an extremely paranoid period in the Cold War. This text, this word crisis here, is typed. Well, it's actually an output from the Manchester computer, because in a rather nerdy way, Turing wrote a letter which was outputted by the Manchester computer rather than written on a typewriter. It's like an email before you could actually send an email. He did do some rather nerdy things like that, but that's, again, a way of joking with the situation, trying to deal with it in a way that keeps his individuality and humour. But the crisis would have been real, and we don't know what further events would have led to in 1954. Again, it was not a case of giving up, in 1954 he was developing new ideas, actually in theoretical physics, something which had been there right at the beginning of his intellectual career, but now wanted to turn back to. He wrote some very strange postcards in May 1954, headed Messages from the Unseen World. That's a reference to a book by Arthur Eddington, whom he'd studied when he was 18, 19. And they gave reflections which were both ironic commentaries on life and also references to current interesting ideas in mathematical physics. What was he going to do? I think in an impossible situation. He was a man who lived for free ideas and free life and hated constraints of any kind, But he himself, in 1938, had chosen to give himself to the state. I mean, he had given his mind essentially to the fight against Nazi Germany and everything that followed from that. So who knows? No one can know what went through his mind. But he died by cyanide poisoning on the 7th of June, 1954, and by a contrivance, which I certainly think the most likely statement is that he did it in a way that people who wanted to could believe it was an accident. It's a bit difficult to see how you could take cyanide by accident, but he did a chemical experiment which used it, and his mother in particular certainly believed that it was an accident that he'd ingested the cyanide, but he left this haunting image, which is very very current now. A lot of people know about that of the poisoned apple, and I think that was a deliberate image. Very recently, another writer, a very well-known writer of children's literature, Alan Garner, has revealed that he went running with Alan Turing. He would have been then 18 or so, but Turing went running in this late Manchester period. And Alan Garner recalls that Alan Turing went over the scene in Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where the poisoned apple arises. Very famous scene, a scene of 1938 again, actually, just the same period, where Turing had dwelt on the ambiguity of the apple and the deathly aspects of it. So that's a sad and very haunting story, and one we'll never know what was really intended. They're all they're just clues, and so Alan Turing's life ended at that point, and who knows what would have happened. But at least the world of 2012, 100 years on from his birth, is a very different one. Not only is the computer now the business of everyday gossip and fun and everything else that people do with them, a completely different world, much closer to his perception of the computer that would do everything, and it was used for fun things as well as for number crunching. But of course his life and his position and his concept of his rights as a gay man, which just didn't exist in that period, mean that his whole life and his whole trajectory and the unity of his mind and his work is now seen in a completely different way from the way that it would have been seen in his own time, and much more accessible to a whole world where in his own time only a tiny number of people knew about his thoughts and his work. They're now things which touch people in a big way. Well, I'm going to end with something much more positive, and again using computers but in an unusual way. So I'm just going to take a shameless publicity for a new event. There's been masses of cultural things which have taken off Alan Turing's work. I'm very pleased to say those who know the leading musicians, the Pet Shop Boys, may be interested to know that in 2 days' time they're doing the first broadcast of a new musical work based on my book, but on Alan Turing's life and work. And of course they are great users of computer technology, as well as all sorts of interesting cultural things. And their production is called A Man from the Future. The whole thing will appear next year, but this is a taste of it. They've just got it into the Alan Turing centenary year. And I'm very pleased about this, and this to me is actually the positive flowering and development of all Alan Turing's ideas into cultural life and our technological, social life of all kinds. And that's the reason why I'm happy to talk about this otherwise sad subject in a way that I hope will convey many new and positive things for the future. So I'll leave my subject with those hopefully cheery remarks. Thank you. Yeah.
I guess we have time for one or two short questions. Anyone interested in asking a question to Professor Hodges?
Did Turing have any direct contact with von Neumann during the war?
During the war, all right. No, there's no known direct contact between Turing and von Neumann during the war. And that's an interesting question. I've emphasized that they had the contact which ended in 1938. That wasn't anything to do with computers when they had that contact. And it's a very good question as to how much von Neumann knew of Turing's work and how much he gained from it in his own formulation of computing and computer design in 1945. I don't know how much detail to go into on that. I mean, the simple answer is almost certainly no. But there's a larger question about the whole interaction of those figures in the late 1930s and how much that was reflected in von Neumann's work. The logician Martin Davis has probably addressed this most directly in his book called The Universal Computer. Martin Davis was a leading logician who's contributed to the development of Turing's work on computability very strongly in the 1950s and 1960s, but also worked with the early computer development at the Institute for Advanced Studies in 1951. So it's a very good position to judge this. And I'd commend his discussion of just exactly this question of what one can trace in von Neumann's writing had come from his understanding of the concepts of the universal machine and computability. So his judgment is that in seeing that computing was going to be about logic primarily and not about doing arithmetic primarily, that von Neumann was strongly influenced by Turing's exposition of this idea in his paper of 1936. But it's very hard to give a proof of this or to establish exactly what would have happened without Turing's work and things of that nature.
Did his death influence the development of the Wolfenden report?
That's an yes. I think probably not, but it is important that his death, the trial and the prosecution and the whole what happened between 1952 and 1950 wasn't in isolation. There was a large wave and great rise in the number of prosecutions generally, and more importantly than that even, there was publicity, there was discussion, there was therefore a raising of consciousness and identity in the British society generally. And that's one of the factors which went into the Wolfenden Commission as it was set up in late 1954 to report in 1957. Alan Turing himself said that he'd written to an MP to complain about the state of the law. In fact, when he was arrested, he said, "I thought there's a Royal Commission sitting to legalise it." I mean, his attitude was certainly that the law was ridiculous. And he was absolutely with the kind of people who are agitating for the reform, which actually took place, not until 1967. So that was where he was in a wave of people who came out of the Second World War thinking that had been a war for freedom and change, and they weren't going to be pushed back into an old world of total restriction and imprisonment. So in that sense, he was it wasn't just an individual story. But I couldn't say that there wasn't much in the press about his. I mean, I think it was probably suppressed essentially because he had this important status. Is not that his trial and his death were great celebrity events of the day. They were pretty well hushed up, so not many people knew about them. So that you couldn't say that they gave rise to the reform of the law.
Okay, I think we should just take the opportunity to thank the speaker again. Thank you very much.